Next, we have with us Dr. Dilip Raman, who is the Director, Cloud Physician Healthcare Limited. He also manages the tele-ICU. His special interests are ventilation, and he's with us to decode what ventilator modes we should be using for preventing acute lung injury. Dr. Dilip Raman. I'm sure everybody is looking forward to hear from Dr. Dilip after the ventilation workshop yesterday.
Thank you, guys. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for having me here again. One important thing I learned in 2016 in TAS is to stick to your timelines and your, make sure you don't exceed the time limit. So I think Dr. Senthil took away 2 minutes of my time. So All right, so we'll start without further ado on how to do an ultra short talk. So preventing acute lung injury. Do ventilator modes matter? That's the question that TAS has assigned to me. And the clear and easy answer is no, of course not. And that's the end of the talk. So, literally that's how short the talk is. This is how it's done, right? But if you look at your pamphlet that's provided on the second page, TAS has assigned me another, yeah, exactly. So it's 2 talks. So, I didn't plan this. This is not a typing error or a printing mistake. We actually have 2 talks at the same time. So how do we really prevent VILI? That's what it is called, no matter what the mode. I think we need to figure out what we're doing on the ventilator, and part of this talk is to sensitize you on not looking at the mode, but looking at the ventilator, looking at certain forms of trauma that you inflict upon the lung that you can minimize with various strategies. So let's first revisit the term itself. Ventilator-induced lung injury implies that all the fault lies with the ventilator and that spontaneous breathing is okay. So that does require a paradigm shift in thinking. It's not just ventilator associated, it is ventilation associated, meaning any form of injurious breathing can do this. It doesn't have to be the ventilator. Even spontaneous breathing, which we'll see in the subsequent slides, can be harmful. So you can't really prove that every single time it was the ventilator that did it. You may have patient factors that resulted in the same outcome. So, my mentor always says this, there are only 3 goals. You can say oxygenation, carbon dioxide clearance. Simplicity always prevails, and what it is just a matter of safety, comfort, and liberation. That's what a ventilator is supposed to do for the patient. And safety encompasses everything from hypoxia, hypercarbia, protective settings. Everything comes under safety. So this is how I try to think about mechanical ventilation. And over time, we found that there are a lot of ways that we injure those sensitive alveoli that are sitting at the periphery of the lung, of the pulmonary tree. And you have volutrauma, very commonly talked about. You have barotrauma. Yesterday, we were in the workshop and someone brought up barotrauma. It's really probably a misnomer now because we don't think of barotrauma as a major mechanism by which you have lung injury, and I'll come to it as to why that is the case. You have electrotrauma, far more common than previously thought, and we'll elucidate that as well. And a couple of new guys that I want to introduce you to is one is ergotrauma and rheotrauma. If you don't remember the names, that's okay. You just try and understand the meaning as we go over the slides. And the typical final pathway is release of these cytokines that mediate biotrauma, which is the eventual lung injury, the SIRS response that can happen just by ventilation. So these are the broad categories that we're going to talk about. So I'll tell you about 2 common divisions, the volume control and pressure control. We talk about the mafias in our workshop. You have the army that only wants to do volume control, and you have the folks that only want to do pressure control. But the point is, you need to figure out ways of handling all those types of trauma, no matter what mode you have been dealt. So volutrauma is simply the over-distension, getting more volume into the alveoli, and the membrane stretch, and there's some strain on the alveoli causing disruption. And in volume control, it's fairly straightforward. You control your tidal volumes per ideal body weight. You get the plateau pressure to be a little lower so that the baby lung, the smaller lung, is not overstretched. And conversely, in pressure control, you can actually end up doing the same thing because most ventilators are so advanced these days that if you set really tight pressure limits, you are going to very closely match what you can do with volume control. And I like to call this pulmodynamic convergence. Just like hemodynamics, you can make your lungs which is pulmodynamics, converge towards the same endpoints no matter what mode you use. Just use your alarms wisely, and you can get a bit of both. So barotrauma, interestingly, was defined as a very high pressure, around 50, which we rarely use nowadays. And you hardly see it anymore in modern ventilators because that degree of pressure-related damage to the alveolus doesn't happen. And I have a picture to get that point across fairly clearly. And in volume control, you can set the pressure limits to achieve that. And we'll talk about how you can get a plateau pressure alarm to kick in. And in pressure control, since you're controlling pressure directly, it's self-explanatory. Now, when you put a pause, an inspiratory pause between the flow, between inspiration and expiration, you achieve zero flow. When you have zero flow, that's your plateau pressure. So you all know this. You do an inspiratory hold, you get this. You can also set this on a GE vent or any other vent by setting the inspiratory pause percentage. And when you have an inspiratory pause, the ventilator will show you what the plateau pressure is. Some of the ventilators will allow you to set an alarm to that plateau pressure. As long as you have the alarm functioning, you will always know if you've hit an injurious plateau pressure. Peak pressures do not injure the alveoli. Peak pressures dissipate in the airways. So Adalectomy trauma is a trauma that's because of repeated alveolar collapse and expansion. And it's seen in the alveolus as a cartoon here will show, which is, you see that happening? That's a cartoon for atelector trauma where the two alveoli on either side were enlarging in volume just because the one in the center was collapsed. And that collapse, that alveolar collapse, is what is mediating atelector trauma. So I wanted to have a picture example of what it is like so that you can remember it without remembering the term. Now this is a pig lung, and this is a normal alveoli in a confocal microscopy. I wanted to share these videos with you because a picture and a video will share a lot of clarity here. Can we play the video one more time, please? So basically that's normal lung without ARDS, inflating, deflating just fine. Looks pretty, we're all happy with it. Now this is an ARDS model. You can see that right here, this is your right lung. This is the pig lung. It's called the extra lobe, the right lobe of the pig. And look how the collapse is going. Like these alveoli that are not there, they're all collapsed alveoli. That's atelectomy trauma happening in real time. So this is where some alveoli should have been. They've not been inflated. So this is an ARDS model lung for the pig. And it happens again. We'll go to the next slide. As I talk to you about recruitment, this comes up a lot. Can we prevent trauma from a recruitment maneuver? And can you play the video, please, of this one? Play the video. You can see as time unfolds, the rabbit lung is gradually expanding, but look how much time it takes. I love it when people talk about recruitment as if it's the next best thing since sliced bread, but it takes a lot of time. This is a real-time expansion video of a lung, and it's going to take 17, 18, it goes on, and you will not achieve complete recruitment even until you reach 35 to 40 seconds. So recruitment is not something easy. It takes a lot of time, which is why sequential stepping up of PEEP over a long time is what makes a difference. Short recruitment maneuvers are not, as I'll show you. So can you guess this mode? I'm going to play the video. What mode is this by looking just at the alveoli? Look how it's expanding, staying expanded, and then going back down. Any guesses as to what mode this is? It's not volume control, because remember in volume control the IE ratio is 1:2, 1:3. There's a lot more time in exhalation. But look here. Can we play it one more time, please? This is everybody's favorite. This is APRV. They always talk about APRV, long inspiratory time, short expiratory time. It'll help prevent de-recruitment. But guess what's happening? It takes hardly like a fraction of a second to de-recruit. So even if you're doing APRV, it's not like you're magically going to keep the lung recruited for a long time. I'm showing you a video example, no graphs, nothing. I'm showing you exactly how quickly the alveoli de-recruits. So recruitment takes 40 seconds, de-recruitment takes 0.4 seconds. Can we play this video? What mode is this? It looks like atrial fibrillation of the alveoli, right? Yeah, this is high frequency. This is why everybody was so excited about high frequency, because literally you have the alveoli that's open and just quivering. It's never closing. Turned out it was negative, couple of negative trials, OSCAR and OSCILLATE, but the reasons for those negative results are different. But again, I wanted to share you how much work has gone into historically into figuring out these problems of lung trauma. Okay, so in biotrauma, you have release of cytokines and chemokines that we talked about. There's something called mechanotransduction, which is the mechanical energy from the ventilator is transduced into the alveoli and causes destruction. And you can use, again, both modes to decide how to protect the lung. And it's frequently there's an overlap between the strategies. You have paralysis, you have prone ventilation that tries to equate the differential pressures, the differential distension that's going to happen in the lung to minimize these problems. But again, the central message is no matter what mode you try, you're always going to be hurting the lungs. And that comes to a certain basic point that we need to arrive at, which is about the respiratory system and transpulmonary pressures. I think one of the questions again in the workshop was, if you have a laparoscopic surgery going on, the belly is inflated, how do you control your pressures? How do you ventilate the patient? So if you understand the concept of the transpulmonary pressures, it becomes a lot more easier. So airway opening minus the body surface area gives you the trans-respiratory pressure, pressure differential across the mouth and the chest wall. The next one is the transpulmonary pressure, which is the difference between the airway opening, ET tube, and the pleural pressure. If there is no airflow, you can even substitute the alveolar pressure as the airway pressure because the flow is zero. And the example I'm trying to show you here is that if you have a balloon inside a thick metal bottle, okay, you can keep inflating the balloon. You can give a barotrauma pressure of 50, the balloon is not going to burst. Okay, the chest wall, the tight chest wall, that bottle is going to prevent barotrauma, which is the basis of prone ventilation, which is the basis of traumatizing this rabbit. So apparently a few scientists thought that rabbits look really cute, but they look even cuter if you coat them with a thick plaster of Paris cast. So that white thing around is a cast around the rabbit's chest. And what they're trying to show you is the same thing I showed you with the other example, which is the glass bottle around the balloon. It's the same analogy. And what they're trying to do here is they inflated the pressures from 15 to 30 to 45. And they found that if you have the cast around, the leakage of capillary fluid, which is given on the y-axis, is almost nothing. So the blue bar at the end is a closed chest without the plaster of Paris cast, leaking capillaries when you go to a hurtful pressure. But here that cast around that rabbit saved the rabbit, right? So proning has the same theory. You put the patient prone, you're essentially putting a small cast on the front of the chest. That's what you're doing. So a poor man's proning that we used to try was we'll put 6 or 7 saline bags on the patient's chest, and if their oxygenation gets better, we know that they might actually respond to proning. So then you flip them over. So that brings us to the two new things that we want to talk about. One is ergotrauma. You can again forget the equations, but the point I'm trying to make is the net energy that you give to the lung is what is going to cause lung trauma. Okay, it's like Salman Khan punching the villain in a movie. You give one punch, you hurt one part. You keep punching, there's a lot of damage you can do to the face, right? So that brings rate into the equation. Historically, we never really put focus on the respiratory rate as a form of lung trauma. But imagine one breath hitting, second breath, rate is going to have an impact. So this concept of ventilator power, which is energy per cycle times frequency, may give you an idea as to why HFOV may not have worked, because the frequency was quite high. So it's possible that the ergotrauma that you were actually inflicting was no different from what you were inflicting when you were on volume control. So sensitize yourself to this type of trauma as well. The other interesting point is that when you increase the PEEP, if you keep the tidal volume the same, you still may be only doing a fixed amount of work. So you may not be giving that much power to the patient, which is where the concept of driving pressure comes. So there are a couple of recent articles, 2015, 2017, I think, Amato did some work where they found out that the driving pressure is what is going to determine everything. Turns out the driving pressure is just a feature of the power inflicted by the ventilator on the patient. So, it seems like a sad story. It seems like we have no way of winning this battle. No matter what you do with the ventilator, you're going to cause pain. So the last form of pain that was, or trauma that was inflicted on the lung was discovered fairly recently, more by the pediatric people, which is known as rheotrauma. Rheo meaning flow. Again, we were not very concerned with flows until we realized that if you use a high flow initially, you could potentially be damaging alveoli. And again, people who used to support pressure control had to eat their words, because pressure control would give you higher flows. And that flow could cause damage. So in this paper, it was published, they showed, again, this is not a human model, but they showed that when you had volume control at 2 different flows and pressure control, you can see that the flow is, you can see here that the flow is markedly different. High flows in pressure control. Flow brings lower flows in volume control here. And the least one here, when you adjusted the volume control to an IE ratio of 1:2, where your inspiratory flow is fairly low. And what they found in this model was, right here, this is the pressure control model. This is the volume control model with 20% time in inspiration. This is the volume control model with 50% time in inspiration, meaning a very gentle, slow flow rate. This is an animal study, but it's fairly instructive in the sense that even flows can potentially be damaging, because they equated all other factors. Plateau pressures, tidal volume, rate, everything was same in both the lung models. The only thing that was different was the flow rate. So, something that I would like to, you have a question? Sorry. You have a question? Oh, sorry. Thought you raised your hand. I think we can do questions afterwards, but the point that is the most important to take home is to borrow a principle from radiology. Radiologists often talk about the principle of as low as reasonably achievable. So we always have numbers thrown at us. Go for a plateau pressure of 30 or a tidal volume of 6 to 8. But they also say that you can go to 4 to 6 if you can. And if you can ventilate and have safety metrics and comfort and liberation metrics in line with a plateau pressure of 25, maybe you should try 25. If you can ventilate a patient with a rate of 14, you don't have to meet the ARDS criteria of getting the rate to 35 or 30 or 25. If the PEEP table is in front of you, and the PEEP table says that at an FiO2 of 0.6, you should be at a PEEP of 12, but you can get away with reasonable dynamics with a PEEP of 8 and have less work done on the patient, maybe that is the take-home message that might come in the next 3 to 5 years. We don't know that, but what we know for a fact is that there are various forms of lung injury that can be mediated upon the alveolus, irrespective of the mode. Because I've just shown you some examples where volume control is worse and where pressure control is worse. You are not going to have your cake and eat it too. So how do we figure this out in day-to-day practice? One thing you can do is you can try and limit the driving pressures as much as you can. Don't use it as a therapeutic target, but try and understand the concept behind it. Try and see how much you can get away with the least amount of work done by the ventilator onto the lungs. Transpulmonary pressures, this is an important concept. So if there is a little bit of time, so we can go back to the transpulmonary pressures, and I can show you. What you can set is try to see that the distension of the lung during exhalation and inhalation is minimized. How you do that is, let's take the example of spontaneous breathing. The idea behind spontaneous breathing is that the ventilator is doing less work. That's the thinking behind it. So you set a pressure support of 5 and a PEEP of 5, for example. That means the net inspiratory pressure is 10. Okay? So your transpulmonary pressure would be airway pressure minus pleural pressure. At inspiration, the airway pressure would be around 10, because you add both the ventilator pressure and the pressure at the airway opening. The total is PEEP plus pressure support, it's 10. Because the patient is breathing spontaneously, they generate a lot of negative volume, negative pressure. That negative pressure can be minus 20, can be minus 15. If they have ARDS and they're getting worse, that negative pressure can be very high. Don't underestimate that. So minus pleural pressure. So pleural pressure is already negative. Let's say it's minus 20. So it's 10 minus 20, which means it's a plus 30. So here in inspiration, you have a transpulmonary pressure of plus 30. is spontaneous ventilation. It's simple BiPAP with a mask, but it's definitely injurious. You have a transpulmonary pressure that's very high. So don't for a moment think that spontaneous, just because you're spontaneous, is probably not hurting the patient. We don't know that for a fact. So it's really important to sensitize yourself. So that's why probably the paralysis studies, the studies that involve low tidal volume ventilation and paralysis in the first 48 hours showed some benefit, because it's possible that this transpulmonary pressure mediated injury was going on even in spontaneous breathing patients. So with that, we'll come back to the next point on the protective ventilation mantra, so to speak, is again to come back to rate. Remember, rate is a component of power. Try and go for a rate that's as low as possible. Allow a higher CO2. Permissive hypercapnia is still cool, I think. I don't know if time will change that, but as of now, it's okay to have an acidic pH. Tidal volume, in a patient with ARDS, a lower tidal volume is fine. But as we addressed in the workshop, if you have a patient with COPD with high compliance, it's okay to give them a tidal volume 600, 700. If their lungs are big enough and they don't have ARDS, it's safe, because the net amount of work that you would be doing on them is low. Because when you go up on the tidal volume, you'll go down on the rate. Their rate may be 8 or 10 because they're COPDers, they need a long time for exhalation. So the net work that you may be doing is still going to be in the safe range. And then flow, like we talked about, pressure versus volume control. You'll notice that in this conversation, this talk, I haven't spent a lot of time talking to you about low tidal volume ventilation and all the ARDS trials. I've spent more time talking about the concept of power, the concept of work done on the lungs per unit time. And this probably is something that may be more and more relevant in your practice as more and more complex modes, terminologies, and studies come into play. It's essentially the ventilator equivalent of less is more. So that's what I want to conclude with, that if there's anything that you want to take from this is try and understand the concept of ventilator power, try and understand the concept of how much work the ventilator is doing. And we've had a few slides and discussions on our Facebook group as well as to how that power can be minimized, and maybe that's a separate discussion. But for the purpose of ventilation-associated lung injury, these are the few points that I wanted to share with you. So I'll conclude with that and leave some time for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dilip, for a lucid presentation of a very complex topic. We have time for questions.